Gaming is an interesting industry because it's this cross section, right, of entertainment, art, and creative expression and technology. Every form of entertainment that is out there already, or a lot of them at least, they require technology to some extent. You gotta have cameras to record the movie, you gotta have computers to edit it. And music's the same thing. But the way that this content is created and designed to be consumed is a bit different from gaming because you can take a music file and play it on virtually any device, and the same thing with a video file. But when it comes to games, you can take a Switch game and easily play it on a PlayStation or an Xbox or even PC. There are methods there, but it takes a lot of work. And so it's a bit different as an industry, and because of this big tech component of gaming, a lot of tech companies have tried their hand at becoming gaming companies in some way. And also obviously because of the big profitability of gaming, that has become more and more evident in recent years. So when modern gaming sort of began, you think back to the early days of what is, I guess, the current era of gaming. You think of companies like Atari, Sega, and Nintendo. Those weren't really tech companies before they made video games. But after that, we saw a bunch of players that came in that were tech companies beforehand. Sony was already making a lot of tech products before they made the PlayStation. Microsoft was already a juggernaut before they came out with the Xbox in 2001. And more recently, we had a company like Google, which tried to break into the market with Stadia, and obviously that failed miserably, and we'll get to that. Or Amazon also has their service now, Luna, which is very similar to Stadia. But the point is, you see a lot of these companies try to break into gaming because they have technological prowess to do a lot. But an example like Google Stadia was really, when we became so apparent that being a tech company doesn't mean that you can be a valuable or interesting company in the gaming space. Stadia didn't understand what it takes to be an interesting gaming platform or to even make good games at all. So, they launched this service. It was mostly reliant on existing games from other publishers that weren't exclusive, and most of them weren't even that interesting in the first place. And they had little to no internal development, or any idea of what made a game good. They got a couple of exclusive games that were totally worthless. They had this one called, I think, Get Packed, which was just a clone of Moving Out, which was a multi-platform game. So that was barely an exclusive. They had at some point Pac-Man Megaton Battle, which was this sort of battle royale game that could only work on Stadia because of the power of the cloud. And then after Stadia shut down, I'm pretty sure that game came to other platforms anyway. So that was a lie. And but either way, they weren't, great games. The only one that could have been argued to be a fantastic game would be Baldur's Gate 3, but we had no idea how good that game was going to turn out to be. And Stadia died long before that game got the chance to even see the light of day. So it didn't matter in the end, and I don't know if Google actually understood that Baldur's Gate 3 would be such a great game. So it was obvious, the entire time that Google was present, that they didn't know the importance of having a strong creative team that was passionate about making games. And they gave up on it. And they didn't even really try. Like the Stadia, after about a year, they announced they were closing down their internal development efforts, and they were just focusing on being a platform for other games. And even then, shut down like what, a year or two later. Like it was a very half-hearted effort from Google there. And it made it painfully obvious that no matter how much money you have, no matter the technological prowess that you have, it doesn't just work. It's not enough to just have that money and the technology, and people won't care about the work you're doing. You need to have something more because gaming isn't just a tech product, it's a creative industry. It's something that is driven by passion and creativity from the people behind it. You can't just throw money at it and expect it to work. And while Google made this incredibly apparent, I think there's a company out there that has been in the game for much longer and still doesn't seem to really understand that either, despite surviving in the gaming market all these years. And of course, that is Microsoft. So I know saying that's probably going to outrage some people, but it's also not going to surprise a lot of other people. But yeah, Microsoft, I think a lot of people would agree, has been, you know, fumbling the bag for the past few years. Actually, I would say for the better half of its lifetime, because you think back, this started around what, 2010, and we're now 2024. So considering Xbox appeared in 2001, more than half of Xbox's life has been fumbling the bag, as I just said. So it's not a great track record to have, being this far in and still having all these problems. But I would argue that it started even before that. So you think back, to the beginning of Xbox's life, and there's some defining franchises there, like Halo and then Gears of War on the Xbox 360. But were those franchises even, Microsoft's doing? Halo was in development since the late 90s. And at E3 2000, when Microsoft showed up as a platform with the Xbox, Halo was at E3, but not at the Xbox show. It was shown in Apple's presentation at E3 because it was in development as a game for PC and Mac, or only Mac, I'm not entirely sure. But it wasn't an Xbox exclusive, and it wasn't being made by Microsoft. There was this company called Bungie was making the game. It was a third-person shooter at first, and then Microsoft acquired Bungie, and that's how Halo became an Xbox exclusive. It wasn't some grand idea that Microsoft had with its teams to just make Halo. This started before. There were some big changes that were made under Microsoft's leadership, but it wasn't a Microsoft idea. And Bungie kept making Halo games for 3 iterations. They made Halo 1, 2, and 3. And Halo 3 was the final game in the trilogy. They had a tagline, finish the fight, I believe, for that third game. And Bungie wanted to be done with it. Microsoft didn't like that. So, they pushed them to develop a couple more. They made Halo Reach, which was a prequel. But Bungie was done. And eventually, Bungie just left Microsoft. So, what happens then? Microsoft founded 343 Industries to continue making Halo games. And what happened to Halo games after that? They weren't good. They didn't please a lot of fans of the Halo series. Like, Halo 4, I think, was alright. I played it. I don't remember much about it, but it was okay, I think. And then Halo 5, they totally ruined the plot by trying to make Cortana evil. And it didn't feel like Halo. Like the enemies were, there was a lot of strange stuff going on with Halo 5. And then Halo Infinite was actually a very fun game. Like, I think the gameplay loop in Halo Infinite was super enjoyable. And I really enjoyed using like the grapple shot, and I kind of tried to act like Spider-Man sometimes, traversing the world. The gameplay there was really fun, but it was still a very bland and repetitive world in Halo Infinite. You can tell that after Microsoft had to start its own development team to make Halo games, they just went downhill. Once they lost Bungie's talent, it didn't mean much. They couldn't do much to make interesting games. And this story just kind of repeats itself. You think it started all, in the 2010s there. But this kind of shows that Microsoft doesn't really seem to have that capacity to start or to create something that is appealing and creative. And it kept repeating itself, this sort of pattern. A year after the Xbox launched, actually, Microsoft acquired Rare. Rare was a huge studio, not in terms of size necessarily, but in terms of its impact. They worked mostly with Nintendo, and they made some of the best games of the past two generations at that time. So on the SNES, Rare had made the Donkey Kong Country games, the 1, 2, and 3. Absolutely beloved games, at least the first two, I believe, are very well received. And then on the Nintendo 64, they did so much. They did GoldenEye 007, one of the most defining first person shooters at the time, still one of my favorites. Perfect Dark was very similar in terms of how it played, but had a totally original story and setting. They made Banjo Kazooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Diddy Kong Racing, all games that if you ask a Nintendo fan that was more involved in Nintendo's history back then, they will all tell you that these were some of the absolute best games on that console, and a lot of them deserve the better legacy than they got. But Microsoft acquired them in 2002, and you think that's a huge move. I mean, it was a huge move. It was one of the best studios out there at that time. But after the Microsoft acquisition, they didn't do anything that was interesting. They made a remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day, which was Conker Live and Reloaded. But they took this really mature M-rated game with a lot of like adult themes and adult humor, and they censored more of it on Xbox, which is like the platform you go to be mature and and rude, I guess. I don't know. And they censored more of it than the Nintendo version of that game. Like that doesn't make any sense to begin with. They made a prequel to Perfect Dark. I believe they made ports also of Banjo Kazooie, maybe. I'm not sure. They did make a sequel to Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, and people kind of hated that as well. And then anything that Rare was really known for just completely vanished after the Microsoft acquisition. No one cared about what Rare was doing, and in fact, when Rare was acquired by Microsoft, about 30 employees left the company, which just kind of also sets this trend that like Microsoft tends to gut the studios that they buy and takes away the things that make them special. You have these creative teams, you think buying these creative teams works just because you have that money, but it's not like that. It doesn't just work like that by buying a well-known studio. It takes creativity to keep making good games, and when you let all of these people go and you pressure them into doing things your way, it's probably not going to work out well. And it just kept happening. These kinds of things just kept happening. Gears of War, another defining seminal franchise for Microsoft. You'd think maybe that was made by Microsoft? No. Gears of War, the first three games, were made by Epic Games. The guys that make Fortnite now. Those were the titles that made Gears of War famous and that people actually liked. But very similar to Bungie, when the first three games were done, Epic Games was like, we're done with this. We have nothing to do here anymore. And they stopped. They weren't going to make more games. So Microsoft, again, had to scramble. So what did they do? They bought the rights to Gears of War from Epic, and they founded their own internal studio, the Coalition, to keep making Gears of War games. And my understanding is that no one cares about the Gears of War games that came after 3. I played Gears 5. It was playable. I have no attachment to it. But I don't know, it exists. But my understanding is that no one cares about Gears of War anymore. Microsoft gutted it of what made it appealing to people in the first place. And so you look back at all of this, and it really shows that anything that Microsoft seems to do well is because it's bought out. And it does well only until Microsoft starts getting more involved with it. Halo got bad after Microsoft took matters into its own internal studios. Gears of War got pretty bad after Microsoft started making its own games. And then Rare just completely disappeared almost when Microsoft bought the studio. So you can't just keep spending this money, buying studios, contracting games to be made for your platform, and expecting that to be just the great solution that you need to make your platform appealing. Because the moment you lose those contracts or you lose those teams, you don't know how to keep it going. And that's the big problem with Microsoft. And it really came to a screeching halt in those 2010s that I mentioned earlier. Because this is when Microsoft introduced the Kinect. And this came because Nintendo had launched the Wii in 2006, and it was hugely successful with the casual crowd, while Xbox and PlayStation 3 were obviously focused on more hardcore gamers up until that point. But both Sony and Microsoft figured, the Wii is being so successful, we should try doing something like that. And they did. Sony made the PlayStation Move, Microsoft made the Kinect, which on a technological level was way more interesting. But the thing is, Sony understood that the Move wasn't the future of its platform. It was a good addition to have that option for more casual players. But at that time, Sony kept investing in its core franchises. You had things like Uncharted still coming out. The Last of Us came out a few years later, and those are fantastic games. But Microsoft just kind of went all in on Kinect after that point. So there wasn't really much interesting happening with the Xbox 360 after the Kinect came out. And to make it worse, Microsoft doubled down on this for the Xbox One generation. Kinect was mandatory, it was included with the console, and you had all these other things like a mandatory internet connection, and you couldn't play used games. And Microsoft just completely lost the plot at this point. And the Xbox One was way more expensive than the PlayStation 4. It was just a whole mess. Microsoft basically lost the generation as soon as it started, or even before it started, just based on that announcement alone. And the games just weren't coming still. Like, Microsoft never managed to come up with great games for its platform. And the ones that eventually came out, there were some great games that were, eventually exclusive to Xbox, even if temporarily, like Cuphead or Ori and the Blind Forest. But those weren't even made internally at Microsoft. So it really shows like how much that company struggles with giving its developers and teams like just the resources to do well. And Microsoft's approach, more and more after that point, has been to just keep throwing money at the problem. They keep buying these studios. I think it was in E3 2019. One of the big announcements, the things they had mentioned at that presentation is how they had acquired like 15 studios in the past 2 or 3 years. That's not something you brag about at E3. That's not what people at E3 are there for. They're there for to see, they're there for the games. They're there for good games. They want to see games announced. They don't care how many studios you're buying, and it's not a good thing to buy a bunch of studios if it doesn't equate to you actually giving them a chance to keep making good games. So the acquisition of those studios isn't what makes a good platform. But Microsoft seems to be completely lost, and they think that buying companies is the solution to everything. And it just isn't. And they spent billions of dollars on this. After those 15 studios that were mostly small ones, they spent 7.5 billion buying Bethesda, like a huge studio. They spent 69 billion later, 69 billion buying Activision. Why? You don't need to invest all this money buying other companies and consolidating the industry into one big conglomerate and just depriving it of that variety of people. But that's what Microsoft keeps doing, and more it's becoming apparent that it doesn't work because they still don't understand. No matter how many big studios they buy, they don't understand what it takes to make a good game and to have a good creative team making those games. They just care about the profits, which they're a company. I know profits are the only goal they have. But in gaming, you need to have a bit more forward thinking than that. You can't just think about the short term. But that's what Microsoft does. They threw $69 billion to buy Activision, and shortly after, they let go of thousands of employees and they dissolved the few companies that they had already purchased very recently. They dissolved studios that were making good games. The only good game that Microsoft really had in 2023, like the one thing that got universal praise, was Hi-Fi Rush. People loved that game. The artistic style, the gameplay was fun from what people say. I actually haven't played it. That was a fantastic game by a Bethesda studio called Tango Gameworks. And it did well. Like they praised it left and right after it came out. And then they shut down that studio because they had to make some money back or cut costs after spending 69 billion buying Activision, which they didn't need to do. But this is all Microsoft keeps doing. They invest all their money, they put all the money in the wrong places, and they don't understand that having a creative team is more than just buying people out. You need to create a good environment when people feel like they can be creative and safe making those games. You can't keep making them feel like their job is on the line all the time by dissolving the studios right after you buy them. If you do that, people aren't going to be at their most creative state. That's not how it works. But it's that philosophy that Microsoft always has. It's just money, and we have great technology, and we have Game Pass, which is great value, but you don't have games that people want. And on Game Pass, sure, you can say, oh, I can only pay like $15 a month to play any game that I want. But you're probably only going to want one or two games from that library. And you're going to keep paying monthly when it will probably be cheaper in the long run to just buy that game outright. And you could play it whenever you want it. Instead, with Game Pass, you have to keep paying to even be able to play that. You don't get to keep that game after you've played it. But it's just this. It's an attempt to get goodwill from Microsoft, right? They make it look like a good price. It's very affordable. We got access to all these games for a low price, and it makes it look like a very good deal. And they just use that as a way to try to counter the fact that they just don't have appealing games to the platform, and they're shifting the focus away from their platforms, their consoles. They don't care about their consoles anymore. It's all about Game Pass. They even have this ad that came out last week about how, oh, every device is an Xbox, because you have Xbox cloud gaming. That's their focus now. They're not trying to make good games anymore. They're not trying to have creative teams that are interesting. They're just trying to buy as much as possible, consolidating it into their big service that's a good deal for now, but it keeps getting more expensive too. Like, that's not gonna last forever if you don't make interesting games to play on that catalog, because eventually people are gonna be like, I'm not using this. Like, there's not enough games here to justify this, and you're gonna start losing money on that. So, calm myself down a little bit. Microsoft simply does not understand what it takes to make a good game. I do want to just offset this a little bit because I don't think Microsoft is stupid in general. Like, I think Microsoft has a good understanding of what developers want, and they have a very good, they have the technological understanding, of what they need to do. They have very good hardware. They have, very good technical know-how. They have great consoles. The software, I think, for the Xbox consoles is interesting. They have the best controller, I would say. Like, the Xbox controller is probably the most comfortable and easiest to use. But they just don't understand what makes a game fun. It seems like the only games that Microsoft develops internally that are actually good are more simulator type games. Forza Motorsport is a very well loved game if you're a racing fan, but it is a racing simulator. That's not for everyone, and fun is not the same concept of fun that a game usually has. It's a different kind of fun. And similar with Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is also developed internally. It's also, very beloved by the people that like that kind of software. But it's not really fun in the way that a game usually is, I think. And then, a series that actually is fun, in my opinion, Forza Horizon, that's developed internally now, But it's only because the studio behind Forza Horizon, which I believe is Playground Games, was acquired by Microsoft recently, like in that 2019 spree, I believe. That's where Playground Games was acquired, and the Forza Horizon series was born well before that, when Playground was still not a Microsoft studio. So it's interesting that it just seems like Microsoft has a really hard time coming up with fun gameplay concepts and making fun games that people actually want. There's no passion behind a lot of the games that Microsoft makes, and it's really hard for there to be that passion when they acquire these studios that cost billions of dollars. And the move after that is to just let go of thousands of people because they have to offset the costs of purchases that they didn't need to make. I don't understand why it keeps being this way. It's so frustrating. And I'm very upset that Microsoft keeps acting this way and that they've been in this game for 20 years and they still don't get it. And it seems like they get it less and less. All they care about is purchases and bringing in more studios. And you know that comment that that Phil Spencer made at one point about how his dream was to like buy Nintendo? Like, why is that a dream? Why is your dream not to make games that are on the level of what Nintendo makes? Why do you have to buy everything out? Why is that your goal? That is not the purpose of a gaming company, or maybe not any company. Your point isn't to buy the entire market for yourself, is to make a product that can compete in that market and be more appealing than the other ones. But that just doesn't seem to be what Microsoft wants to do. And that's why I think they're the worst gaming platform, because they just don't want to be a good gaming platform. They don't understand what it takes to make good games and to make a platform appealing. And then they blame things on other platforms when they could try to fight back. They say that, oh, we spend, no matter what we do to make Xbox appealing, Sony was going to keep making their big Sony games exclusive to PlayStation, or they're gonna keep buying exclusives from other companies so they can leave them out of our platform. And it's like, you can do that too, but you have to understand that Sony is also making a lot of good games with its internal studios. They spend a lot of time building internal studios or forming internal studios, over time, and sometimes acquiring them too. That's okay to do that sometimes. But Sony invested a lot and it understands what's needed to make good games. I'm a Nintendo fan, but I'm not blind. I know that a lot of Sony games do have passion behind them. They can make weird decisions sometimes, but that's not why Sony is famous. It's because they have some great games that are exclusive to PlayStation. And Microsoft just looks at that and keeps making bad games and just, or buying games that are well known and hoping that they will keep selling well just because people know the name. And they gave up on actually trying to make good games internally, and they'll just be like, well, the other guys aren't being as nice as we are. There's nothing we can do about it, so we'll just let them make our games available on all the platforms we can, even if the other guys aren't doing it, because no matter what we do, we can't make our platform appealing enough for people to buy our consoles. You don't have to give up, you just have to actually try. But anyway, that was a very long rant, and it just upsets me. I wish Microsoft would actually put the effort into making good games, into fostering these creative teams internally at Microsoft. And you don't need to spend billions of dollars acquiring other companies. If you put some of that money into hiring people and giving them stable jobs in a stable environment where they can feel like their creative abilities are being rewarded, you could have a lot more appealing games on your platform. So just stop trying to buy everything. Think about what makes a game good. Hire passionate people. Let them be passionate. Don't punish them for that passion. And you'll see that eventually you can have some great games on your platform. And people will want to buy that platform if the games are good. So that's the moral of the story from this entire rant. So If you watched all the way till the end, thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.